Bismillah Rahman Rahim and Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome to another Tabadlab Policy Roundtable. This one is kind of a follow-up to a previous roundtable that we conducted about three and a half months ago. And in that roundtable, we were privileged to have the former Deputy Governor of the State Bank, Dr. Murtaza Sayed, Maheen Rahman, who is also joining us today. She's the CEO of InfraZamin, has extensive experience in banking and finance and understands the economy like few others do. And of course, Khurram Husain, who is a very dear friend of mine personally, but also an important voice in Pakistan in terms of guiding and helping us navigate through the various iterations of reality as they kind of emerge and sustain themselves. Khurram is also joining us today, and Khurram has written extensively about the topic that we're discussing. We have two other guests who I think are fantastic additions to the conversation. Ammar Khan is a commentator on economic affairs. He's running a startup that is engaged in the microeconomy. And he's got extensive experience as a risk analyst in the financial sector and the banking sector. And perhaps most importantly, we're joined by Dr. Aliya Khan, who's the former head of department at the Quaid-i-Azam University and has focused on the human development aspect of macroeconomics in the way that we tend to discuss it and in the way that we plan to discuss it today. So I sort of thank all four of you and welcome you back to this conversation in the case of Maheen and Khurram, and welcome you to the conversation in the case of Dr. Aliya Khan and Ammar Khan. I wanted to start with you, Maheen. About 3 months ago, we had this conversation, and the question there was inevitability. The question was, is default inevitable? And I think the conclusion, we were all trying to be as positive as we can, and the conclusion we tried to draw is, well, it looks like it's inevitable, but it might not be if Pakistan does the right things. And at least my view at that time was very strongly that Pakistan didn't seem that it was on the track of doing the right things and that it was not going to be able to do the right things. And lo and behold, it continued to not do the right things. Its finance minister continued to say almost every wrong thing and do with the presentation of the budget, do something that I think was extremely damaging in terms of at least securing the last tranche of the IMF and avoiding default. But like a bolt of lightning, Pakistan miraculously seems to have stumbled upon a 3 billion standby arrangement with the IMF. And a lot of, I could hear, I'm not in Pakistan currently, but all over the world, you could hear the sigh of relief emanating, not just from the Ministry of Finance, but I think from every serious Pakistani who cares about her or his country, because a default is really a kind of a very, very bad scenario. I guess the question, one question or one set of questions might be around, well, how did this happen? And I think we will discuss that. But I really want to focus today's conversation on whether this $3 billion injection, assuming that it goes through, the board meeting is scheduled for the 12th of July. I suspect by August, if everything goes well, the first tranche would have been paid in, and the immediate threat would have been averted. But is this just a delay of the inevitable sovereign default, or should we stop throwing this word around and मतलब पहले बाज नहीं आए थे तो अब बाज आ जाएं और default की बात ना करें, बल्कि we should be celebrating the very special and clearly miraculous work of the Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister. Maheen?
Thanks for that intro, Mosh. And yes, when we met last, it looked very dismal, but I think all of us were on the fence as to whether or not default would actually occur. And it seemed as we went down that the last few months, it seemed an inevitability, to be honest. But I think with a few last minute negotiations, and I honestly wouldn't even call them negotiations, I would call them just simply doing what the IMF had actually asked them to do many months earlier. So unfortunately, all that time could have probably been saved if we had just completed a few of those steps a lot sooner. But nevertheless, we are here, and at least for the time being, it has given us a fair amount of temporary relief. It's not just about the $3 billion that IMF gives us. We all know it's also got to do with the commitments that come after that from other multilateral institutions, as well as other sort of bilateral partners that we have. So for now, it does seem that for at least the next 6 months to a year, perhaps, we will be in some degree of economic stability, which is much needed. And it will allow at least some room to breathe, to take a look at some of the economic policies that have to be changed. And there are quite a few of them which we can go into in this conversation. But I think what is also going to allow this government to do is enter a political process and open the road for elections without significant worry or damage further to the economic environment. And I think that was also pretty crucial because just simply securing an additional $1 billion from the IMF and then going into an election cycle, that would have been, as difficult to manage as the current situation. So for now, I think it is fairly reasonable to say that at least for the next 6 to 8 months, we look quite comfortable. I think the other important thing to consider is that economic headwinds are dying off, and not just because of the sort of IMF deal, but we are seeing inflation taper off under this particular cycle. Global commodity prices are coming off, which is helping Pakistan significantly and will continue to help us over the second half of this year. So at the same time, interest rates appear to have peaked with the last increase. And it looks like we will be in some relative form of stability, if not growth, for the next few months at least.
Khurram, it's an interesting conversation that we're sort of restarting. And this, what Maheen said to open the conversation, at the risk of angering Maheen, is almost what I kind of expected from most voices. And my fear is that this comfort of at least we have a few months, I think more like a few weeks, but okay, a few months, maybe November, maybe December, maybe it goes into next year, and maybe we actually have some growth. Maybe oil prices keep going down, and things turn around as miraculously as we all want them to. But I'm not sure that necessarily delays or puts off the conversation about debt restructuring, because the debt profile of the country has not been cured. The only thing that's really happened is that the immediate urgency of getting the IMF to sign off on government policy, that urgency has been addressed, and the IMF has signed off or is on the verge of signing off in the next week or so, inshallah. And absolutely, inshallah, right? Like, nobody sane wants a default. So I don't think that's really the thrust of at least what I want to happen in the country. But I think these conversations are important because I'm not sure that people realize that this $3 billion injection is merely, instead of me framing what it is, Khurram, what is this $3 billion injection? Because I'm afraid that the thing that it's going to be most importantly is that it's going to be a route for us to avoid a conversation about serious debt restructuring in Pakistan.
Okay, Musharraf, there's one basic fact at play here in this conversation, and that fact has not changed as a result of this IMF program. And that fact is that Pakistan is borrowing money in order to repay its debts. And so we are actually carrying a debt burden. The country is carrying a debt burden that its economy is not really in a position to carry. And the position that we were in the last time we had this conversation, we would have been in that position a year earlier had there not been $5 billion worth of additional borrowing that took place in fiscal year 22. So you'll remember there was a $3 billion Saudi deposit from Saudi Arabia in December 2021. There was $1 billion bond floated in January 2021. There was another $1 billion IMF tranche that came, I think, in February or late January 2022. So had that $5 billion injection not come in, by about May, June 2022, we would have been we already were in a very tight position, but we would have been on the very edge of a potential situation that people are calling default. But as a result of that borrowing, we put it off by 1 year. Now what we are seeing is additional borrowing, because this standby arrangement is expected to now unlock additional lending and borrowing inflows from bilateral partners, which will perhaps give the economy another 9 months, maybe another 1 year before it depletes its reserves once again. So in a sense, the inevitability, the question of whether or not default is inevitable, the answer remains the same. I think if we keep going down the road that we are currently on, yes, it's inevitable. The only question is the timing. When will it happen? Last time we had this conversation, many of us were seeing a high likelihood of such an event happening sometime in calendar year 2023. That has now been put off to calendar year 2024 as a result of this IMF arrangement, which is a good thing. Because second half of calendar year 2023 sees a transition of power in Pakistan from one government to another. And I think while that transition of power is underway, the steps required to manage the country's debt service obligations were not going to be possible, because you would have a very sort of a weak government with a very limited mandate in the form of an interim government, and not really empowered to take any strategic decisions. So it's a good thing that we've managed to at least find bridge financing to get us through this period of uncertainty that will come during the transition of power. From January of 2024 onwards, we should be under a new elected government with a longer term mandate, and quite almost definitely once again entering a long-term IMF program, a long-term EFF to last for 3 years. And at that point, the question of Pakistan's debt sustainability is going to resurface. And that government will then have to make a decision and make a call on what to do with this rising debt burden, and what to do with this economic path that we are on, which requires us to borrow more and more money just to make it through the year. Clearly, that path is not sustainable by itself. So yeah, I think the question of the inevitability of default has been averted for now. Calendar year 2024, we'll be back to facing this question again. And I think in the context of whatever next IMF program Pakistan has to sign, this question will feature very prominently, and we'll wait to see whether the fund does a new debt sustainability analysis, because the current DSA, as they are known, that we are operating under, was done in 2021. So it's based on data up till about December 2021, I think. Since then, of course, a lot has changed in the debt profile, in the larger economy, the growth trajectory the economy is on, the assumptions underlying that DSA will need to be updated. And what the new DSA finds regarding the sustainability of Pakistan's debt and what needs to be done to restore debt sustainability, we'll have new answers to that. And I think this conversation will then need to be held one more time at that stage. Musharraf?
Thanks, Khurram. Yeah, I hope, in fact, that we can continue having this conversation more than once in the run up to, for example, the April 2024 maturing of at least one of our, I believe it's a Eurobond or a Sukuk, but one of the bonds that's out there. So I think this is a conversation I would love for us to keep coming back to. Dr. Aliya Khan, one of the parts of this conversation that gets less attention is the impact of all this on ordinary people. So, we saw, at least in some WhatsApp groups, if not on social media, immediately after the announcement of the new SBA, we saw conversations about how Pakistan's bond prices have doubled, and this massive rally at the Pakistan Stock Exchange, and the dollar to rupee rate has improved in favor of Pakistanis. And it would be, I think, unfair to suggest that all of these things don't matter at all, because certainly I think a change in the dollar to rupee rate, for example, might have a positive impact on inflation, insofar as it would slow down inflation, if not, in fact, reverse the rise of some prices. So perhaps in terms of buying power, it's meaningful. But a lot of the conversation around sovereign debt actually ignores or evades or avoids the fundamentals about how all this affects ordinary Pakistanis. Last time we had this conversation with Maheen and Khurram and Murtaza, we talked a little bit about the impact on the middle class, the lower middle class. We're clearly seeing a distinction, I think, in terms of the impact of rising prices between cities and non-cities, or urban and rural areas. There's certainly something to be said about migration. When we met 3 months ago, we were talking about a Pakistani hockey player that had died off the coast of Greece. Now, we've been talking for the last couple of weeks about as many as 300, maybe more Pakistanis that have died off the coast of Greece. Could you just help us relate these two different streams? It feels like there's a separate macroeconomic conversation and a separate conversation about what it means for ordinary Pakistanis. Dr. Aliya? And before you start speaking, sorry, we'll need you to unmute so we can hear you. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you for raising this very important perspective and linking the IMF SBA, after which some macro indicators, or rather some monetary indicators, have started showing a better picture, and the real economy, as we term it in a macro theoretical concept, which talks about output and employment. Because I think we need to connect the two conversations, and I think that the sooner we do it, the better it is for us, because going forward, we have to understand that Pakistan is in a debt trap. Pakistan is in severe debt distress, and Pakistan has a pathetically low growth rate for a country which is a young country of 250 million, which seem to be the latest projections from the 2022 census. So how do we bring these two strands together? I think I have been reflecting on it, and I see no way out except for some kind of debt relief measures that Pakistan would have to get into negotiations with, because we really do not have the fiscal space left to create the kind of employment and to kickstart manufacturing, whether it is large scale or small and medium scale, that can generate the kind of national income that, given our limited tax mobilization, would help effectively in addressing the debt servicing problem. So one aspect is that we need to also critically analyze how our public sector development program, the PSDP, is helping us in overcoming, or in not in overcoming, that is an exaggeration, in trying to move towards a lesser degree of debt distress. And why do I say PSDP? Because that is the engine through which fiscal policy works. And if we just keep on focusing on monetary policy and fiscal policy to the extent of tax revenue mobilization, we are not really addressing the whole story. So I'm glad you've given me the opportunity to sort of kickstart this conversation through the Tabadlab Roundtable, that we need to not only look at the macroeconomic framework as it relates to the IMF SBA or to an IMF EFF, but to also look at our sectoral policies, because we cannot visualize Pakistan moving ahead in a direction where it is not going to go deeper into debt distress if we don't do that, and do that soon. So I'll stop here, and I invite you to sort of, excavate these issues more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aliya Khan. I think there's a lot to excavate there, and I want to come to the question of debt relief. I want to bring that question both to Maheen and to Khurram because they both follow this. Maheen more from a Pakistan perspective, and I know that Khurram has been examining debt distress and default in other places. I know Zambia is a question that's live. And Ammar, feel free to jump in on the question of debt relief as well. But I specifically wanted you, Ammar, to talk a little bit about where Dr. Aliya left off. This question of fiscal, and especially in light of things like the Federal Public Expenditure Review that the World Bank just came out with. There's so much evidence, not just in one place, and in many places. Most of all, I think, in the presentation of the budget. I think at the beginning of June, when the government placed before the country and really before the international community Pakistan's fiscal plan, which is what the budget is for this coming year. And it was very clear from that Khurram's warnings about whether we're taking this seriously, Maheen's sort of concerns about whether we're taking this seriously enough, that those questions were really answered very clearly and very directly, and that was that Pakistan is not interested as a polity in addressing the very fundamentals that will determine whether this country is serious about fixing this in the medium to long term. That Pakistan is very serious when it comes to avoiding default tomorrow, next week, the week after. That Pakistan is very serious in terms of engaging the global elite, whether it's the MD of the IMF or the leadership of Saudi Arabia or Beijing or other countries. But when it comes to actually fixing the things that are within the control of the Pakistani elite, military, civilian, bureaucracy, politicians, industrialists, that combine of the Pakistani super elite seems to have almost zero interest in solving these problems. Is this an exaggeration, Ammar, given your examination of the budget so far? Please unmute before you respond. But I'd really like you to talk a little bit about the fiscal element or aspect of this whole question.
Yeah, thank you, Mosh. So I'll just keep it simple here. Interest expenses, the markup that we pay on the debt we have, both domestic and external, that makes up about 77% of the total taxes we collect. So whatever tax we collect, more than 3/4 of that simply goes towards markup payments. We're not repaying our debt. That's just the interest payments that we make on those markups. From total revenue, around 65% of total revenue is just markup expenditure. So whatever the government is generating as revenue, it's essentially paying that out in markup, which really squeezes the room for any kind of development or social expenditure. If we look at on the expenditure side for the last 10 years, we can see that expenditures have outpaced revenue growth by a factor of roughly 1.3. So if revenues increase by 10%, expenditures increase by roughly 30% or 25 to 30%. So as expenditures keep outpacing revenue, it is just difficult for any kind of fiscal consolidation. About 4 years back, interest payments made up around 50% of total of tax revenue. Now they're 77 to 80%. Going forward, as interest rates have increased, both locally and on foreign debt, we may see this number increasing to 85 to 90%. It is important to note here that over the last 10 years, dollar liquidity or foreign exchange liquidity was fairly easy to get because interest rates are fairly low globally, around 0% on the dollar for the longest time. What was at 0% on the dollar 2 years back is now at roughly 5%. So the cost of borrowing is also increasing. If I just look at the budgeted numbers here, the markup on foreign debt has increased by more than 4 times, something that just completely disappeared. So as we keep on taking more debt, even if it's concessional, because we get some concessional debt, on top of that, we get more commercial debt, our cost of borrowing is going to increase, our interest expenses are going to increase, and we are not generating sufficient revenue. We are not expanding our tax net accordingly, and neither are we rationalizing our expenditure. One thing here is pension expenditure. Pension is essentially a liability. It is a debt that the country has, but we don't really recognize it as a debt. We just pay it from the budget. That is going to increase. That may touch ₹1 trillion in a few years, in about 2 to 3 years' time. Do we have sufficient resources? Are we generating sufficient taxes? Are we generating sufficient revenue to cover that? We are not. So if we consider markup expenses, if you look at fixed costs like pensions, military, basic running of the government, nothing is left essentially to do any kind of social or infrastructure or PSDP spending. This is why PSDP has largely stayed static, or in fact, it has also decreased in certain years over the last 10 years. And so not a lot is happening on the infrastructure side, not a lot is happening on the product, on the development side, because we don't really have fiscal space. Whatever fiscal space we have, it is going towards markup. And when that is going towards markup expenses, we just have to take more debt to essentially run the government. So essentially, we just get stuck in a debt trap because we are not able to, or we don't want to fix our fiscal position. As Khurram said earlier, we have maybe room for another 9 to 12 months. Earlier, that room was around 3 years. So our boom bust cycle was generally in the range of 3 years. That 3 years got shortened to 1 year. Now that maybe got shortened to 6 months. So there's just so much debt you can assume and run the country in the hope that we get some breathing space and not do anything about it. Eventually, we may hit a point where whatever revenue we're generating, most of that is essentially going as interest payments. And we just have to create more and more debt, eventually leading to a situation which isn't good for basically anyone in the country.
So it sounds like, more and more, there seems to be some degree of consensus that we've both averted and delayed sovereign default, but we're not really having the serious conversation we need to have around, I think, the two questions that have now sort of come up, Maheen. One is the question of debt restructuring. Yeah, we've agreed that we probably still need to do some sort of restructuring. But the other question that Dr. Aliya has raised is this question of debt relief. And I think maybe there's a combination of those two that is required. In the current sort of global and regional scenario that Pakistan finds itself in, compared to other peer countries, and we can pick up close to the region here in South Asia, we have, of course, Sri Lanka, and then we have examples from other places, including Zambia, where some modicum of restructuring is taking place, but it's been very slow and it's been extremely painful in those countries. How do you see this playing out? Is Pakistan likely to secure debt relief before having to go in and restructure? What does a restructure look like at that point? Do we see another collapse of the rupee, another collapse of Pakistan's ability to import, Pakistan's ability to pay its bills? Or is there something before all of this that will avoid all this and go to that maybe more positive and optimistic scenario of a little bit of growth and a little bit of reform, combining to make it to make 2024 much better than these last couple of years? Maheen?
Sure. So I'm going to flip some of this around back. We're using words such as debt restructuring, debt distress, unsustainable debt levels. If we look in absolute terms at our debt levels and compare them to the rest of the world, we are not at, say, 200% debt to GDP. We are not even at 100% debt to GDP. We're at about 80% on our international or US dollar denominated debt to GDP. So in the broader context of it, it is not in its absolute form something that would raise alarm bells if you just pick that up as a statistic. What causes us issue is something that Ammar has been talking about, and that's related to our revenue generation capability as an economy. Now, what you have to understand is we're 250 million people. We have a certain requirement to import or to consume a certain quantity of goods just in order to maintain a baseline degree of living, which is where we are at right now. And the reality is that what's become unsustainable in the entire equation is the debt is sort of standing out as a sore thumb. But the reality is, look at our tax collection and look at our tax revenue. And until we begin to broaden the revenue base, either through wider tax collection across different sectors, especially the ones that are not taxed, or then make this country far more attractive as a capital inflow or investment inflow destination, we're not going to be able to raise that revenue or get out of this so-called debt trap, right? So there is only so much that we can do. We would reduce the size of, in an ideal situation, you'd reduce the size of government. You could even restructure some of the debt to be very long-term. Incidentally, the vast majority of our debt is exceptionally long-term. We talk Paris Club and we talk multilateral debt, which is about $45 billion. It's half the debt. That's extended over very long-term and very low interest rates. So how much more restructuring are you going to ask there? The real sort of pain point for us is perhaps the commercial loans that we have, the Chinese commercial loans. But I think that too is a conversation to be had on bilateral terms in terms of how those can be addressed and shifted to long term. But even with moving all this debt to a very, very long-term, low interest rate restructured scenario, you still have that problem where the citizens of this country and the businesses of this country refuse to pay tax in certain situations, which is why you have effectively 3 to 4 million tax filers. And you have a vast majority of earning individuals and earning corporates that sit outside the tax net and are happy to pay indirect taxes. This is what is now completely unsustainable about the fiscal position in Pakistan. We can argue that it is a breakdown of the social contract where individuals don't trust government enough to pay that tax. But the reality is that those non-tax paying sectors have been that way for the last 50 years or so. So perhaps the real structural reform, before we even go to our international creditors, and they will ask us the same question, that what are you doing in-house to fix the situation so that you're not in this debt trap again? We need to have the answers with us, that what are we doing with regards to the really tough decisions with relation to structural reform, in particular tax, and in particular making ourselves more attractive towards foreign direct investment or even domestic investment. So I think that conversation on all these aspects of debt relief are all great, but at the same time, without a sustainable story inside Pakistan with regards to actual revenue generation, it's going to be very challenging to continue to make the argument that we need debt relief, but we're not willing to fix anything internally for that to happen.
I think that's a really powerful point. Let me take that to Khurram. Khurram, there's, I think, two things that I want you to talk about. One is the comparison. Maheen talked about this as well, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about where Pakistan stands with respect to some of these other countries and this conversation around debt relief. But I think the other point that Maheen has raised is really important. One, we need to get more serious from a fiscal perspective. But within that, I think we need to maybe unpack the element of indirect taxation versus direct taxation. How much more of a burden can the middle class and the salaried class in this country bear, especially given that we see a repeated reassertion of the super elite and elite's refusal to carry any of that burden. And then maybe speak a little bit about growth, because maybe the ultimate solution to all this is really a fast-growing economy. Khurram.
Okay, Sharaf, on the tax side, what we're seeing happen is the legacy of an agreement that was reached. And by agreement, I don't mean sort of in a formal sense. It was more sort of an arrangement that emerged in the 1980s between state and capital. And that arrangement can be summarized in the words rents and rackets, because what happened back then was the state, as it withdrew from its earlier nationalization drive, entered into an agreement with big capital to say that we'll provide you opportunities for rent seeking, and in return, you take up long-term investment positions in Pakistan. And for small and medium enterprises, they were basically given a laissez-faire commitment, in the sense that the state said, we won't bother you with regulations, with administered prices, we'll generally leave you alone. And in return, you're free to you don't come to us asking for concessional credit, access to concessional credit schemes or various things. The rent-seeking opportunities were left for big capital, and for small capital, they were told, you just we leave you alone, you leave us alone, and that's your investment program, so to speak. It's under this arrangement that we developed and grew the kind of industrial structure that we see in Pakistan today. It's dominated by high levels of monopolization, high levels of cartelization, and big capital tends to find it very difficult to operate in the absence of rent-seeking opportunities. And around them, there is a sea of informality. The informal sector which back in those days, in the 80s, we used to call it the cottage industry, if you'll remember, Musharraf. And there were active policies by the government to encourage and promote cottage industry. There was a cottage industry policy back then to help people set up small businesses outside of the tax net, outside of the regulatory framework, outside of everything else. It's as a result of that arrangement, for example, that today you can operate a small industrial unit in your home, get a commercial gas connection, for example, at home without having a registered business enterprise. You don't, the utility will not ask you for proof of registration of a business in order to give you a commercial gas or in some cases a commercial electricity connection. Now what's happened is that this arrangement did help promote short spurts of economic growth. It did bring in investment into small protected islands. So we had investment flowing in at that time. In the 80s, it began with automobiles, you'll remember. And then it grew into cement, and we've had a lot of investment in the power sector under similar sort of schemes to create islands of protection amid a sea of informality and a sea of free and liberalized capital flows all around it. Now, the limits of that particular approach are coming cascading down upon us, because it's as a result of that compact between state and capital, which gave us growth on the one hand, but it has run its course in terms of the fiscal requirements that it takes and the kind of rigidities that it has created in our fiscal base. So now the state finds itself in a position of having to go back and renegotiate that contract and tell small and medium enterprises that, well, now we want to document your incomes. And whenever you see traders, for example, retailers coming out on the streets to protest against a value-added tax, for example, what they are doing is they're actually reasserting the terms of the compact that they had.
Is part of the problem, Khurram, that, going back to this compact that you've described really, I think, very, very beautifully, isn't part of the problem here that we're going to these tajers and these small and medium-sized traders and asking them to pay into the system by being documented and obviously paying more tax. But it's not like they can go to the bank and get a loan in normal countries. And I use that term not ironically. In normal countries, the purpose of a banking sector is the ability to drive traffic from small and medium to large, right? That basically you have small and medium companies that grow into large companies principally on the back of course, innovation and technological prowess and getting lucky, but principally in terms of, you know, the banking sector financing that growth. We don't have that in Pakistan. We have a banking sector that is singularly dedicated to public debt. So, you know, how much of this equation, the state capital equation, has in a sense corrupted or contaminated the rest of the economy and the rest of political economy as far as decision making is concerned?
I think it's the overriding framework within which economic decision making takes place. So you can call that contamination, you can call it, you know, refer to it by any other word, but this compact is the main reason why a reform initiative or sort of a, you know, an overall reform thrust has not really emerged within Pakistan over the past 30 years. Whether we talk tax reform or reform of our industrial system to broaden, you know, let's just take reform on two fronts: to broaden the tax base and to broaden the export base of the country. The reason why no action has really happened on either one of these two fronts is because all economic decision making takes place within the context of this framework. And yeah, I'm sorry, that's the extent of the answer I can provide it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think it would be unfair and probably very, very taxing for us to go beyond that in a short conversation where we have limited time. Dr. Aliya, what does this mean for women, for example, who are already suffering from incredible amounts of incongruence or asymmetry as far as access to finance is concerned, as far as ownership of mobile phones is concerned, as far as basically the securing of fundamental economic rights is concerned? What does it mean for poor communities, for the urban poor in particular? What does it mean for urban to rural migration? Rural to urban migration? And what does it mean for this larger question, which we only tend to focus on when we see a tragedy off the coast of Greece? And I keep mentioning Greece because Greece is very much the country that has been assigned by the European Union to keep certain kinds of people outside Europe. So when you put all this together, what is the interplay here, and what is the formula for getting out of this? I mean, we've talked a lot about this problem, but what are some of the solutions that are going to push Pakistani elites to make different decisions and to get out of the state capital compact that Khurram has described and into a space where some of these decisions are going to start benefiting ordinary Pakistanis?
Okay, there are no quick fixes and no easy answers, but one way would be to use data in the sense that I really fail to understand why the 22% female labor force participation rate of Pakistan, which is the lowest in South Asia, and the second, third position from the bottom in the global gender gap index, why doesn't it shake the policy tables? Because unless we get our attention focused on these issues that sort of underlie the real economy, as I referred to, we can keep talking about the plethora of reforms that Pakistan needs. I mean, in no way was I suggesting that, we can get away without doing tax reform and widening the tax net and, the tax base. and documenting the informal economy. But where are our policies to register the informal enterprises? I mean, I've spent my entire academic career researching the informal economy and the role of women as workers in the informal economy. And even though we pass laws to prove that, we are satisfying the spirit of the international obligations like CEDAW and ILO conventions, we do not seriously implement any of that. So unless, and our whole agriculture economy, in which women are employed to the extent of 70 to 75%, is totally out of, any formal worker-employer framework. So unless we pay serious attention to straightening our labor market functioning and also bringing in considerations like future of work, the other economies in South Asia are training their youth for the future of work requirements. We are relaxed that, Pakistan has a large number of freelancers, but we really are not exploiting our technical vocational education training systems to orient the other youth for growth and manufacturing. So I think that maybe, I don't know, maybe somebody needs to pick up a hammer and hammer these things down, that, you will be totally case in history if you don't start looking towards these issues seriously. So obviously women make up 50% of the population. They contribute to the economy, but they are not documented. They're not recognized. They do not have the kind of economic rights of minimum wages or, good working conditions, occupational safety and health. I mean, I could go on and on, but we choose to ignore this conversation and just, remain fixated on solving our from one debt crisis to another, how to get financing to steer us through. So I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. I think we all feel, I think you're really channeling something that, is felt widely, even during this conversation. A lot of the commentary and feedback that we're getting in real time is really an expression of that. Maybe frustration is a strong word, but certainly a sense of wonderment as to what it'll take to shift or help transition or help evolve the way decisions are made. Ammar, I mean, I snicker only in the sense that there's a certain sense of deja vu in all these conversations. Before you speak, I'll ask you to unmute, but let me frame the question for you. There is clearly an element of this that is related to human capital. And there's an assumption that because Pakistan has a huge population and a young population, that is in and of itself an insurance policy and a risk mitigation against the worst case scenarios. Talk to us a little bit about how that might be true, but how it might not be true. I mean, I don't want to push you in one direction or the other. As somebody who's, I think, rigorously and vigorously promoted the idea of this demographic dividend and this potential that the country has as a market, if nothing else. I'm also increasingly conscious that if that market has nothing to buy and nothing to sell, and has people who don't have enough economic growth being delivered to them for them to afford more and more every year, that actually the size of the population and the youthfulness of the population are really meaningless. Is that too harsh? Am I being too negative, Ammar?
You're being too positive at this stage. Let me just put it this way. Demographic dividend, I would say, it's, if not much is done, it may actually turn into a demographic liability. If you look at the numbers that are coming from malnutrition, around 40% of children under 5 are malnourished. Our child mortality rates have not improved. In fact, they have worsened. Stunting rates in Pakistan, around 15 to 20% of children under the age of 5 are either stunted or wasted, which means they do not get enough nutrition. So essentially, we have reached earlier, or maybe about 10 years back, the problem was putting kids in school. Now I feel the problem is feeding children so that they can be put into school. We're not able to feed our children well. If they're not going to get nutrition, then they won't be able to contribute in a productive manner when they grow up. And I think we can see that even right now. There is a severe food crisis. Food inflation over the last 1 year has been 50%. If you compound over the last 3 years, prices have increased by more than 80 to 90%. And real incomes have not increased. They've actually stagnated. If you look at over the last 5 year or 5 year period, if you let's say look from 2018 and 2023, real incomes have largely stayed flat or even have declined. Food inflation, meanwhile, has actually increased. So there is less money available to feed children, and households do not have a trade-off to either feed their children or send them to schools. So that demographic dividend is slowly turning into a demographic liability, just for the basic reason that we are literally not even able to feed our children. One small example here, as Maheen said earlier, rightfully said that we're a big economy and we have import needs, we have consumption needs. We import about $4 billion of edible oil or soybean. Every single thing in our agri value chain, a lot of things are essentially imported. Poultry, which is essentially the consumption of it gradually increased over the last few years, largely because its real prices were stable. Its real price has jumped by around 50 to 60% in last 1 year, just because the government did not have enough dollars to import soybean in a timely manner and ensure that its supply chain did not get disrupted. So just due to supply chain disruptions, due to unintended consequences of supply chain disruptions, food prices shot up. So it's policy failure at this point that we are essentially not able to even feed our children. So we can fix debt, they can be debt relief, the fiscal consolidation can happen. All of these things can happen in 2 to 3 years' time if you put your mind to it. But if you're not able to feed your children, that's a generational loss that we're looking at, and that's essentially an existential issue.
So true, Ammar, and I'm glad you framed it as starkly as you did. I think even starker, the starker the better, because this really is, again, the ignored element of the wider conversation. Maheen, we've talked about fiscal changes, increasing taxes, changing the burden of taxes from indirect to more direct. One element of the fiscal situation we haven't talked about, but again, that diagnostically has been talked to death, is the issue of subsidies. And I want to relate this in a sense to the fact that within this context, your company, and I'm kind of springing this on you, so I apologize in advance for that. But your company's just launched a 2.5 billion rupee bond in an environment of otherwise, sort of gloom and doom. We're seeing, companies like yours finding the space to focus on women, and that's what the bond. It's a women's focused bond. Maybe talk to us a little bit about how a company like InfraZamin is able to do that within the same context as where government continues to spend vast amounts of money. I'm trying to relate a bunch of threads here. Earlier in the conversation, Dr. Aliya talked about how the decreasing PSDP is really shrinking the space for other kinds of growth. And I think that relates very much to, this juxtaposition of InfraZamin doing something, I think, quite grand and really exciting, whilst more widely, we're seeing the scenario that Ammar has depicted, that you have a constant shrinking of people's ability to consume that's now going to the level of malnutrition and compromised consumption patterns. Maheen?
Yeah, and I think you've actually brought this in at a really nice juncture of this conversation. So the reality is that we tend to rely on government for everything, and at the same time, we want to talk about cutting the size of government. Now, whether it comes down to subsidies, which the private sector asks for, or tax breaks, or any other kind of concessions, which I believe that a lot of lobbying takes place for within the private sector, within large industrial groups, in order to get those economic benefits for their own firms. And at the same time, we continue to push government to reduce its structural imbalances. I think we have a responsibility as the private sector to walk the talk as well, right? So what InfraZamin does effectively is kind of closes the risk gaps, if you like, in the economy. What is the reason that we don't see private capital come in to make new investments, which would increase employment, which would increase job opportunities, and address a lot of the human development issues that we're facing? One of the reasons is what has been talked about is the social contract in terms of the rent-seeking kind of behavior of private firms and private individuals that we see. With the net result that we privatized the banks 20 odd years ago, we made them incredibly profitable today. But in terms of financial intermediation, it is limited to a subsect of corporations or the private sector that can acquire credit. And the reasons for that are multiple, but one of them is related to risk appetites of banks, which is in some instances constrained due to the Basel III regulations they have to follow. Now, what InfraZamin does, it risk mitigates and risk transfers. And what we've done with this bond and why it's such an interesting one is that we had an organization by the name of Kashf Foundation, which all of you are familiar with. It's been around for the last 27 years. It's served over 6 million women in terms of their credit needs or small micro loans to rebuild their businesses or their homes or even look at livestock, etc., at farms. And this institution has, developed a very rich history of development of women and financial inclusion. But the sad reality is, if that institution goes into the capital markets, the bond markets, to try and raise capital for itself to continue the good work that they're trying to do, it would be nearly impossible, simply because of the risk frameworks that exist within our capital markets and to a certain extent within our banking sector, that would simply not allow institutions like that to raise money in that manner. Now, with InfraZamin, we have done our homework. So we've done a 8-month due diligence exercise of the organization, and we're very comfortable extending a full guarantee to Kashf to issue a bond whereby we will protect the investors in case of any credit default by Kashf. And that's a pretty powerful statement to make, which means that effectively out of the $2.5 billion, we're not just covering principal, we're also covering part of the interest. Almost a year's worth of interest on the bond as well is covered. And we're simply saying to the bond market that, look, go ahead and invest in this bond. And we will make sure that in case of any event of default by Kashf, we will cover you for all your payments. And we've only done that after coming to a lot of comfort in terms of how Kashf operates. So that way we've connected a certain market to a certain private sector company that needs the money in order to do the good work that they're doing. And it's connections like this that we continue to make and we want to continue to make. And the wonderful element in all of this is that there's no government involvement, there's no subsidy, there's no tax break. This is a commercial transaction built on commercial terms, and it's catalyzing capital from one area and taking it somewhere else, which is exactly the kind of activity that we want to see happening more and more in the economy. So I think we do have a responsibility, as I mentioned earlier, as the private sector, to see and to kind of determine for ourselves where we can work within whatever makes sense for us commercially, and continue to invest in the economy in a domestic capacity ourselves, rather than simply constantly chasing the government for one thing or the other. And it's with that belief that InfraZamin has actually been set up to try and close a lot of those gaps simply because of risk aversions or working in silos, etc. So, we hope to do much more of this in the future. It will be the country's first gender bond. It will also be South Asia's first gender bond, which is a great, I think it's just a great thing to fly the flag on, simply because we are so low on the gender equity index. But I think it's a signal really that we can do more ourselves as individuals and as the private sector, rather than simply constantly, chasing one regulation or, subsidy, etc. So that's my own 2 bits on it.
I think it's very, very exciting and I think empowering to hear you talk about it, especially given the fact that it is absent the crony capitalism that defines so much of the conversation otherwise. Maybe just not a trick question, but just to indulge a little bit of lightness in the conversation, Maheen, if the Kashyap Foundation leadership was to start issuing press statements about its autonomy and its power, and the fact that your 8-month due diligence process was really an impinging of its sovereignty and its autonomy as an organization, how would InfraZamin have taken that as a credit providing organization?
I think in any situation, especially in things like this, you work in partnerships, and partners have to be on the same page. And if we're not on the same page, then obviously those partnerships don't take place. But I think we're incredibly grateful to Kash for carrying that vision of women empowerment and allowing us to be part of it.
I think Roshane has done amazing work, like so many others in our country, over the last quarter century or more, really. And so I'm really happy that two women leaders have come together in the way that you and Roshane have, and that's great news. Khurram, I want to quickly take this scenario to you and ask you where I started, because I wanted to focus on this aspect of aversion or delayed, and I think we've covered a little bit of that. I think we've tried to talk a little bit about solutions or at least ways forward, but as we close out the conversation, I'm still really confused about how Ishaq Dar and the government of Pakistan managed to go from not being able to secure 1.1 billion because of very obviously positive decision averse behavior and statement after statement that seemed almost designed to create more distance between IMF and the government of Pakistan, and how that then suddenly, out of the blue, at least to me, converted into a 3 billion standby facility from the IMF. Any insights or breaking news that maybe you want to share as to how this happened?
Well, before I answer that, I gotta credit you with that rather mischievous question about how would Maheen react if Kashyap were to have said the things you were saying. Don't think I didn't catch what you just did there, because that actually touches on the answer to what you're talking about in a sense. I don't have any particular insight. Any particular inside, line to the decision making that went into this agreement. So the best I can do is just sort of connect the dots and say, look, it appears that Pakistan, the government of Pakistan, struggled with trying to renegotiate the terms of the IMF arrangement that Miftah Ismail had signed. They wasted a solid 9 months in trying to renegotiate those terms, but little by little, over those 9 months, we saw them yield one after another. So if you recall the mini budget of February, for example, that's straight out of the staff report of September 2022, where it's all the measures that were announced in February were listed in September 2022. That this is going to be Plan B in the event that the fiscal outturns are not keeping pace with the projected, with what is projected under the program. What happened with the exchange rate? Back in September, Mr. Dar was talking about the rupee at being less than 200, and I think by the time the standby arrangement was announced, the rupee was closer to 300. 9 months later, the foreign exchange reserves plummeted by about $5 billion because incremental financing was not available. In a sense, they had to basically come around and agree that the terms and the commitments signed in September, which were commitments that were built upon based on the February agreement. It's not as if this was a brand new agreement in September, but deviation from those terms was not possible. And I think they came around so late, they had wasted so much time. But the IMF and I think the larger community of Pakistan's creditors, nobody really wanted that Pakistan should go over a cliff, which is where Pakistan could potentially have been headed had this program been allowed to expire and there was nothing else to step in its place. So they found this workaround, and they said, look, you still have something like 2.5 billion in your quota that's been allocated, and you've more or less come pretty close to agreeing to all of the commitments that were made, but the time left is too little in which to do anything meaningful, and we want you to remain on a program so your government finances stay under surveillance and monitoring from the IMF. And as a result, this seems like a pretty logical workaround. You get an emergency lending arrangement, which is designed to be negotiated quickly for countries that are in or that are facing imminent balance of payments problems. And you take the remaining amount and let's stretch it out for another 9 months. So, in a sense, the 9 months that were wasted have been given back to Pakistan. Um,
I
it seems like a very logical outcome in a sense now that we look back on it.
Sure. I mean, logical in the sense that what could have been done 9 months earlier is eventually had to be done. So all of the bluster, Maheen referred to this as bluster in our last conversation. And it turns out that all of that bluster was for naught. We have to wrap up because I know that a couple of you have to move on. But before we wrap up, I wanted to give both Dr. Aliya and Ammar in that order an opportunity to maybe share some closing thoughts. And maybe also to address a little bit about what the next 9 months looks like. I know it's a big question, and I'm really constraining your ability to answer by saying we only have a couple of minutes left. But Dr. Aliya, how likely, maybe do a little bit of prediction here, how likely is it, given the political scenario where we have the largest and most popular party, so to speak, being in the situation that it's in, an election that is anticipated, but about which we know very little in terms of how free and fair it might be. What is the likelihood of us being able to have this conversation a year from now and not having the same title, sovereign default, averted or delayed, 1 year from now? Dr. Aliya?
There is a high probability that we'll be having this conversation again, given the current political scenario and the seriousness of the political parties for reform, I think, is a moot question. And I'm glad that Maheen and I are on the same panel, because I read about the gender bond, and I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate InfraZamin and Kashif Foundation for making this breakthrough for women in Pakistan in terms of self-employment. So I think the private sector is going to keep playing its role. And the government does remain important in the sense of providing a conducive environment for the private sector to play its role. But I'm sorry, Musharraf, again, I'm not very optimistic given the, I mean, there's a thing called rational expectations theory in economics, and the information set that I have at my hand does not lead me to believe that things are really going to take a U-turn in terms of our seriousness to address the kind of reform issues that all of us have highlighted, be it capital markets, be it human capital, be it regulatory environment. We will do what is absolutely necessary to get the next tranche or the next, funding to sustain us. But I don't know what it's going to take for us to wake up and really address and put our house in order. But I hope for the future of Pakistan and the Pakistani youth that we get serious about this. And conversations like these, I think, are very important, because We hope that some of this does, filter down or filter up against the force of gravity to where it should. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aliya. Ammar, you get the final word here today. And let me just prompt a little more darkness and realism from you. Whilst all of this is happening, what we haven't talked about is the domestic finance and the domestic debt situation. You and I have, of course, spoken about this offline, and I've had this discussion with others on the panel as well. Not to add petrol, very expensive petrol, to an already burning fire, but are you hopeful at all that even with the aversion of sovereign default, that we aren't looking at a catastrophic crisis in terms of domestic debt and Pakistani banking in the next year? I guess my question is next year's panel, 12 months from now, just about sovereign default, or are we going to be talking about the other things that are potentially disastrous that might happen in banking and finance in Pakistan? Ammar?
I think we have averted that for now. What's going to happen is going to be more of a domino effect where we will have to, I don't know, I don't have the right word for it, screw up on the external front first before it hurts us domestically. As Khurram said, we wasted 9 months, and all of the wasted 9 months were essentially captured in increased inflation and essentially increased cost for everything else. Going forward, domestic debt, it's increasing. It's consistently increasing, and government is the largest borrower, and that is a function of a never-ending fiscal deficit. If you do not want to have this panel next year, what needs to be done is essentially fixing the fiscal deficit somehow, whether that's the rationalization of expenditure or expanding the taxation net or something on those lines. Without addressing the fiscal side, we cannot address any of the problems that we have discussed. And domestic debt is essentially largely linked to the fiscal side, because what's happening right now, or what has been happening for the last, I would say, 15 years now, is essentially the government crowding out private sector. So whatever deposits, whatever capital exists, that's essentially 70% of that roughly is captured by the government, while whatever is left, that is for the private sector. So you can't really have any kind of industrial growth or anything on those lines with that. Because the government is such a big borrower, the rates keep pumping up, because the banks can also see, again, interest rate essentially is the equilibrium between the demand of money and supply of money. So the demand continues to increase, and that demand is being fueled by fiscal deficit. So we will see this continuing. But in terms of a complete disaster, I think that we have averted for maybe another 15 to 18 months. 12 months down the road, if you're having this again, maybe I hope it's not default happened. What next? It may be something, maybe we avert it again. Maybe China gives another $2 billion facility, because this is what we've been doing, 6 months, 12 months, something somewhere we get to arrange something. But for how long will we be able to get by through this, through such breathing spaces? That's essentially the question. And whether we really want to keep doing this, and whether that's sustainable or not. It's definitely not sustainable, but for how long can we continue like this? That's anyone's guess.
I'm so grateful, Ammar, for your thoughtful comments, Maheen, for your participation and adding a hint, not a hint, really a dollop of positivity with the description of the bond that InfraZamin is doing with the Kashf Foundation. Dr. Aliya, I'm so happy that you were able to participate, and Khurram, as always, deeply grateful, not just for your participation here, but your general guidance and the fact that you are such an important voice in helping us understand all of this. Your recent piece for Dawn on the importance of understanding how severe and how problematic a default would be, I think, is essential reading for anybody that's invested in the present and the future of Pakistan. Look, there are clearly indications that the public sector, the government, the state at large is cognizant of these problems. Foreign direct investment is something we didn't really dig into, but hopefully in a future conversation, we'll talk a little bit about the SIFC. I have very severe reservations and sort of I think criticism would be a light word. I'm not sure that that's the answer, but maybe it is, and hopefully at least some of these fiscal considerations can be addressed by removing the things that require subsidies, by privatizing on a fast track. For those future conversations, I thank you in advance, because some of you, hopefully all of you, will come back and join us. In the interim, let's continue to pray that some of this reaches where it needs to, and let's thank God and other forces around the world for the I guess the rescue package of 3 billion. I think it's an important injection, but one that may once again delay serious reform in our country. On that note, not too optimistic, but hopefully not too dark either. Thanks for watching, and thanks once again to the whole panel: Maheen, Ammar, Dr. Aliya, and Khurram Husain. Khuda Hafiz.